Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted to be back with you with more insightful guests and evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way we manage our water and environment. A huge thanks to Scube, who are our season sponsor for Season 4, and you'll hear a little bit more about Scube later. We're really grateful for their support. If you're new to the pod, I'm Nikki Roach, and alongside being a passionate advocate for all things water and environment, I'm a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. Our members in over 90 countries are professionals with a breadth and depth of expertise in the topics that are shaping the future of our planet. So let's get started. And in today's episode, we're exploring the legacy that we leave for future generations. And that might sound broad, but all will become clear soon. And to help us understand the topic, I'm joined by a superb co-host, Alex Sobel MP. Alex was elected in 2017 as the Labour MP for Leeds North West and the Shadow Minister for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He set up the Net Zero All-Party Parliamentary Group, and he's particularly interested in the role devolution can play in supporting regional economic development to lay the foundation for green growth, green jobs and zero and low carbon industrial strategies. So welcome, Alex. It's wonderful to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Nikki.
So as usual, Alex and I are going to listen to our guest interview together and then we'll discuss our reflections. And our guest interview today is with Sophie Howe. With a remit set out in law to be the guardian of the interests of future generations in Wales, Sophie was the world's only Future Generations Commissioner. The role is to provide advice to the government and other public bodies in Wales on delivering social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being for current and future generations and assessing and reporting how they're delivering. And Sophie, a mum of 5, named number 5 on Radio 4's Women's Power Hour list, took up post in 2016 and has led high-profile interventions about transport planning, education reform and climate change, challenging the government and others to demonstrate how they're taking account of future generations. And I was really interested to hear Sophie's thoughts on how we can measure well-being.
So our 7 wellbeing goals, they talk about prosperous Wales, a healthier Wales, a more resilient Wales, which is about ecological resilience, a more equal Wales, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, a globally responsible Wales. You can never disconnect things, but our systems of governance and politics and decision making have been devised on the basis of splitting all of those things apart. And it's complete madness if you think about it.
So, Alex, before we hear the interview with Sophie, as we think about the legacy we're leaving for future generations, can you tell me a little bit about the work you're doing on the Net Zero All-Party Parliamentary Group?
Yes, absolutely. We set up the Net Zero All-Party Group in 2019 after the UK was confirmed as the president of COP26. And it was to ensure that we had a broad and cross-party way of working towards COP26. So that was the initial way we worked. We also developed a really close relationship with the Committee on Climate Change and their periodic reporting mechanism and the carbon budget mechanism. We were in the cycle then towards the 5th carbon budget. We had a big presence at COP26. We're now post-COP26, post-COP27, and are now really returning to looking at how we can ensure that we have domestic implementation. There are other groups that look at international climate change, obviously really important, but the Net Zero APPG concentrates on us delivering our commitments in the UK. And in most areas, we are way behind every area apart from decarbonising energy. And that's only because of what we've done around coal. But actually in the next period, if we don't move on gas and actually on biomass, then we'll fall behind again. So there's really important work across every area, and there's a Net Zero group works across all those different areas: transport, housing, energy, nature, right across the piece.
Well, that's a great introduction to the discussion that we're about to hear around future generations and what the legacy is we're leaving. So, time for the interview with Sophie. Let's hear it now. Sophie, croeso i'r blaned possible. Welcome to Planet Possible.
Oh, diolch. Da iawn. That means thank you and very good. Very good Welsh.
Oh, thank you very much. It's lovely to have you here. Tell us a little bit, to begin with, about what the role of Future Generations Commissioner is all about and why it's so unique.
Well, Wales is the first country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations. So we passed this Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015. It came into force in 2016. It does a number of different things. I suppose the big overarching principle is that it requires all of our main public institutions, so our local authorities, our health boards, our fire and rescue services, national agencies like Natural Resources Wales, Public Health Wales, and then significantly the Welsh Government itself, to demonstrate how, when they're taking decisions, they're meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals. Those goals were devised in conversation with the citizens of Wales, where the sort of question was posed, what's the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, future generations to come? So long-term goals that don't change from one election to the next. Duties on our institutions to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all of the wellbeing goals and take all reasonable steps to meet them. And then it does a few other things, but it also establishes an independent Future Generations Commissioner. So my job, I suppose, is I often describe it as kind of coach and referee. So to advise and support public institutions who are trying to meet these long-term goals, and then to monitor and assess the progress they're making.
What an extraordinary remit. And is it the only one in the world? Is that right? There are not any others? Or are you sowing the seeds of others in other countries?
Yeah, we're definitely sowing the seeds of others in other countries. There's one sort of just popped up in Gibraltar, which, Gibraltar's, I think, only got about 30,000 people, but still that's a bit of progress. There's actually an act in development in the Scottish Government at the moment, so they're going to have a Future Generations Act, which we're working with them on. There's been a private members bill in the UK Parliament as well, actually, but, notoriously difficult to get private members bills through. But I think there's been quite a lot of interest from the UK Labour Party, so, watch this space on that one. We speak to countries all over the world, and there's a huge amount of interest in what we're doing in Wales, but I suppose most significantly the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and we've been doing a lot of work with his team, and he has put forward proposals to have a UN declaration for future generations, the appointment of a UN Special Envoy for future generations, and some reforms to the UN's own governance infrastructure. So that has some hugely exciting potential to have this real trickle-down effect to the 193 member states of the UN.
Quite a legacy, really, from the first term of the Commission as well. That's wonderful. I watched your TED Talk, and we're going to put a link to that in the show notes, which I really enjoyed. I was really struck what you said about well-being, and you just began to touch on it there in your intro and how everything connects with it. And regular listeners to the pod will know that I harp on about everything being connected as often as I possibly can. So tell us a little bit more, if you can, about your approach to well-being in the role of Commissioner.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that, the Act is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for a start. And wellbeing is a concept that is gaining a lot of legs. So from, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, her wellbeing budget. There's a lot of countries across the world now adopting wellbeing metrics, which are really trying to measure things, particularly beyond GDP. Because, I would say for too long, we've had this complete obsession with GDP being the end goal, when actually it's just a metrics. And that obsession has been like growth at all costs, at the cost of the environment. Doesn't matter if that, if growth means growing inequality, all of those things. So we've got it really, really wrong. And there's this brilliant kind of quote from Naomi Klein that I love. She says, financial maximisation is like bloodletting. For 2,200 years, we thought it was the answer to everything until we realised it wasn't. And I think that's sort of the direction that we need to go in now in terms of beyond GDP. But in terms of the connections, so our 7 wellbeing goals, they talk about prosperous Wales, a healthier Wales, a more resilient Wales, which is about ecological resilience, a more equal Wales, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, a globally responsible Wales. The reason that they're all interconnected is if we started from the perspective of human health, for example, one of the biggest drivers of human health is income security. We do want decent jobs and we want a strong economy and so on, because that helps in terms of tackling poverty, and that's a big driver of human health. However, there are no jobs on a dead planet. So we can only have a strong economy if that economy is working within planetary boundaries. So there's the connection there. And again, if you start from the perspective of human health, 29% of what makes the difference in terms of a life expectancy gap are your living conditions, so the quality of your housing. Are you living in areas of high air pollution? Can you access nature and public open space? So that's where then the kind of resilience of our ecosystems really comes into play. So you can never disconnect things, but our systems of governance and politics and decision making have been devised on the basis of splitting all of those things apart. And it's complete madness if you think about it, but really difficult to unpick systems that have been operating for so long.
So let's get into that a bit more then, because I'm really interested in how you do encourage and enable those. I think you talked in your TED Talk about unusual suspects. I liked that language. How do you get those unusual suspects talking to each other? What have you done? Give us a bit of a feel for how you've managed to make that work.
So the legislation itself sets out some, particular mechanisms. It establishes something called public services boards. That's a culmination of all of the key public services and others. So like the voluntary sector, like further and higher education, sometimes representatives of business and so on. And they have these particular duties to come together in their local authority area or region and first of all do a wellbeing assessment of what's the long-term sort of wellbeing issues for their area, and then to set a collective plan. So what that is really trying to do is to bring all of the key players into one space to look at kind of where all these issues intersect. So that's some of the sort of machinery. The other parts, really just bringing people together to have different conversations. So to give an example, we have the Arts in Health programme. So that's about recognising the power of the creative industries, culture, all of those sorts of things in terms of benefits to health. And one of our health boards, this is quite an interesting one on a number of fronts actually, Swansea Bay Health Board, they've got 6 creatives in residence in their primary care departments, in their mental health departments, in their assets, actually even in their complaints department. I don't think they call it complaints these days, but you know what I mean. And you're getting a completely different perspective from that kind of creative input. Interestingly, they are also working with the National Botanic Gardens to say, because we might be a health board, but we recognise these connections between human and planetary health. And the Future Generations Act puts duties on us as health boards, not just to work towards the goal of a healthier Wales, but to work towards every single one of the goals, including the resilience of our ecosystems. To do that, they're working with the National Botanic Gardens to make their hospital estate, their sites for nature. That's a kind of practical example of where, traditionally you would get a health board focused on, clinical interventions and, operations and issuing prescriptions for this, that and the other, and thinking, well, everything else is nothing to do with us. But if the healthcare sector was a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitter of carbon in the world. If you think also about all of the waste that is generated in the healthcare setting and how actually we could be thinking about that as part of a circular economy. Saw some really interesting stuff last week actually where EpiPens, for example, are being turned into chairs and a whole load of other things like that. And I think the point here is that what our Act does is, I suppose, initially statutorily requires you to come together in a public service board, but beyond that it provides this really permissive, encouraging framework to say, go out, come together, meet people and talk to people that you wouldn't normally talk to, and find out what is like the art of the possible in terms of making the connections between the different things that you do. And that's become really powerful in some of those examples that I've given you. But even, a while back, I was at one of our public services boards, and the guy from Natural Resources Wales was talking about the Public Service Board priority, or one of their priorities, around tackling adverse childhood experiences. Now, you would not have been in a world in Wales, or probably anywhere else, certainly in Wales 7 years ago, and I don't think anywhere else now, where you've got someone, an environmentalist, saying, actually, there's stuff that we can do in NRW to help to tackle early childhood adversities. It might be a small contribution, but the fact that those people are thinking holistically is massive.
I guess just a challenge. We had a really great podcast a couple of seasons ago on blue and green social prescribing. It's completely new to me. I found it a fascinating conversation. But one of the challenges that the 2 guests that we had on there talked about was demonstrating the benefit. It's really easy, I guess, to look at the benefit of refurbishing a theatre in a hospital, for example. But if you're trying to make investment decisions and your choices are down to, do I buy a new piece of equipment, or do I do some work on something like green social prescribing, being able to make that case is really difficult for social prescribing, for example. So how are you finding metrics for well-being working? Is it working? And if so, how? Because I'd be fascinated to understand that a bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I totally get that. And I've heard that many times. Interestingly, much less now, 7 years in. So, but I was getting, at the beginning, I was getting it all the time from health. Oh, well, we've got to do a gazillion years of research on this before we'll sort of buy into it or so on. But actually, the evidence is there, but we also need to take a bit of a leap of faith. 19% about what makes a difference in terms of life expectancy is about social and human capital. So, is there a sense of community in the area that you live? What are the quality of your relationships? Do you have people you can turn to in your hour of need? We've got this increasing trajectory, really worrying trajectory, particularly amongst young people, of poor mental health. And most enduring mental health conditions last a long time into adulthood, start before the age of 14. And what our Act is really trying to do, and, well, not just trying to do, requires us to do, let's remember, it's a law, is to say you should seek to do the things that have the biggest benefit across each of the wellbeing goals. So you could issue a prescription for antidepressants, for example, to treat mental health. And of course, that still happens. But within our legislation, we've also got these principles around prevention, long-term integration, collaboration, and involving citizens. And so when you look at it in that perspective and say, well, actually, could we be supporting some of the work of our environmental NGOs through social prescribing? That has a direct link, building those relationships and so on, has a direct link to that social and human capital element of addressing the life expectancy gap. We know that there are all these benefits of humans being in nature, and that's why sometimes I think, when we talk future generations, actually, there are lots of indigenous cultures all over the world that have been doing this stuff for generations and generations, and so perhaps we should look to more sensible past generations in terms of the way that they have done things. So I think that what the Act is doing as well is almost giving permission to people, and this is what these champions, I was calling them initially sort of frustrated champions. So these are people who are within a system who can see that there's a much better way of doing things. Why do we continue to just pick up the pieces of problems that could have been solved elsewhere? But the system's frustrated them because the system is short term. The budgets are short term. This is my budget and not your budget, even though we might actually get a better resolution if I gave you some of my budget to do something different, more upstream and so on. So the legislation is giving these frustrated champions permission to challenge that system, permission to take some risks, permission to try and do different things to make those connections and get to the sort of root cause of issues in an integrated way.
Planet Possible is sponsored by Scube, who are at the forefront of innovation, collaboration, digital excellence and customer experience. They help to enable their customers to continuously improve operational efficiencies whilst recognising the importance of and addressing industry-wide challenges such as climate change, the journey to net zero and regularly evolving regulation. At their heart, Scube believe collaboration with customers and industry partners is fundamental to building transformative solutions across the utility sector that ultimately benefit their customers, the consumer and our environment. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in understanding is when there are compromises, when there are difficult decisions to make, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not my job to say, this is right and this is wrong. As an independent commissioner, shouldn't you have more powers to force people to do things or to stop them doing things? And there's a real sort of difficult balance there, isn't there, between elected politicians and a democratic, system where political decisions are taken versus, I'm not an elected politician, I'm independent, my job is to be, I suppose, the voice of future generations. So the legislation is not prescriptive. It doesn't say you must do this or you must not do that and this is the right answer and that's the wrong answer. What it does provide is a framework to test your thinking, I suppose. So you have to start off by considering have I considered the long-term impact of the decision that I'm thinking of taking? Have I considered what problems it might be causing and what I might need to prevent? And then you go back to this point on integration. Is the thing that I'm going to do the thing that best contributes to each of the 7 wellbeing goals? Or is there like one goal that is going to have a benefit and one which is going to have a huge disadvantage? And the really obvious scenario there is economy versus environment, isn't it? Because whenever there's a decision or an issue to consider around economy versus environment, economy wins and environment loses. And that's why we're in the middle of a climate and ecological crisis. So what the law requires is that you apply that test and you show your workings. And that's what I'm asking as Commissioner. You have to show me how you've considered that. Now, if something went to judicial review and, they had showed that they had taken those things into consideration and the conclusion that they'd reached was not a perverse conclusion, but could be a kind of reasonable conclusion, well, there's nothing that I can then do about that. I can't stop them or change it or issue an injunction or anything like that. But it does force that consideration, and there are some really big test areas where that's happened, particularly in relation to government plans to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity building a 13-mile stretch of motorway, where they hadn't applied that. And I called them out and saying, you haven't applied that, or if you have, show me your workings, explain this to me, explain how it's in line with the goal of prosperous Wales, explain how it's in line with the goal of a resilient Wales when it's going through a nature reserve, explain how it's in line with the goal of a more equal Wales when 25% of the lowest income families don't have access to a car. You seem to be spending all of that money benefiting the already better off. And they couldn't show me. They couldn't show me how they did that, and they changed their minds. They cancelled the road building and they're investing in public transport and active travel instead. So that's the power of the framework, I think.
It's a pretty extraordinary example, really. Probably takes me quite nicely onto a period of reflection. So I'm conscious that your role is coming to an end in April 2023?
January next year.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Wow. Right. Even sooner than I realised. So think back a little bit. Would you do anything differently if you had your time again?
I don't regret any of the choices that I've made. The things that I regret is not having more capacity and resources to get involved in more issues, because I know that despite all the really positive and progressive things that have happened, started with cancelling that road, then we had an entirely new transport strategy. We've got a moratorium on road building in Wales, no more roads being built, all being reviewed. First country, we think, in Europe to do a blanket 20 mile an hour speed limit. A lot of that was sort of, brave government decisions, but a lot of that was me intervening and really sort of challenging them. We've got a universal basic income being piloted. We've got, changes in our healthcare system, a new education curriculum. So loads of really cool things happening. But despite that, I know that every day we're still getting decisions being taken that are probably not in line with the Future Generations Act and haven't applied it properly. And, sometimes that's because people don't want to change the habits of a lifetime. And sometimes that's because they don't really understand, what they have to do or how it should work and so on and so on. And I've got quite a small team, about 20 odd people, which sounds like a lot, but when you're responsible for all of those different policy areas, it's not that many. So it frustrates me that there are not more issues that we can kind of take up and get involved in, because I think when we have been involved, some of the things have been transformational. I suppose if I were to have another 7 years, I think the sorts of priorities that I'd be focusing on, probably a bigger focus around energy security, a bigger focus on food systems, and I think probably picking up, it was something that I was going to do just pre-COVID, a big sort of review into the healthcare system, because I think COVID was a wake-up call to a lot of the healthcare system in terms of, who fared worse. It was all the people we knew who were going to fare worse, poorer communities, more vulnerable communities, and so on. I think there's been this realisation there, but I think that there's some real challenges around staving off this just terrible demand to treatment quicker, ambulances quicker, and we need to be turning off the tap of the reasons why people are in the healthcare system in the first place. And, as I talked about earlier, that's all connected back to our planet, our ecological resilience, our communities and so on.
We talked a little bit about some of the high points, but if I was to ask you to pull out maybe a few of your, I guess, the things you're most proud of as a team that you've achieved in that 7 years, what are some of the highlights?
The United Nations adopting a kind of Welsh approach, that's pretty cool. Wales isn't even a member of the United Nations in its own right. It's the UK that's the member. And so I think as a small nation of just over 3 million people, we're definitely punching above our weight there. I also think that some of those, big whole system change I mentioned in terms of transport, I suppose one of the most significant ones, reforms to the planning system. I suppose I'm a bit sort of on the fence about that. We did massive reforms to the planning system in terms of the policy context, aligning it, embedding the Future Generations Act and so on. But we're lacking the resources and the focus anywhere to really try and make sure that your average planner who is then actually implementing that is doing that properly. Slight frustration that I have there. One of the things that I'm so excited about is reforms to our school curriculum. I'm a mum of 5, my eldest is 23, my youngest is 8. And so my eldest went through a school curriculum which was not fit for the future. He's dyslexic. It was not fit for his learning style and so on. It was not fit for bringing our kids out into a world where they're educated on their place in the world and their contribution to the world in terms of some of the big societal issues that we're facing, particularly climate change. But that has now changed. And I told a few people this anecdote. I was having a glass of wine with a few school mums a few weeks back. One of them was talking about her daughter's birthday coming up. And she said that she'd asked for a whittling knife for her birthday. Now, this is because connections back to nature, making the connections between nature, physical and mental health and well-being, and meeting one of the core goals of our curriculum, which is to develop ethical and informed citizens. So they're in forest school and they're doing all these things with connections to nature. And then another mum piped up and said that her daughter had asked for one as well. So on so many levels, as a mum of like 4 boys and 1 girl, the fact this girl's asking for whittling knives because they're reconnected with nature, because we've got a new school curriculum. I always say I'm not sure about the absolute sense of buying a knife for an 8-year-old, but nevertheless, the principles there.
We'll overlook that.
Yeah, in some ways, that one little anecdote or one moment for me, and often when you're in jobs like this, it's all the big stuff, and you're in the media about this, or you're talking about that, or you're challenging the government on that, and sometimes it's a Friday night glass of wine with a group of school mums, and you go, oh my God, that's it. That's the change. And that's the stuff that makes me so excited about what we've done and what's to come, I think.
Got one last question to ask you that I ask all my guests. Let me pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. And if you can wave it and make anything possible based on your experiences over the last 7 years and your career more generally, what would you want to make possible?
My heart wants to say, it's about doing more of this in the curriculum, and it's about, shifting all the ways that we spend money towards meeting our carbon emissions targets and restoring biodiversity and so on. And of course, all of those things are critically important, and so I couldn't just choose one of them. So the one thing I'm going to choose is reforms to governance and the way that we take decisions, because no matter what initiatives we come up with and progressive policies, or no matter what is decided or sadly not decided in COP26 or the next COP or the biodiversity COP, the problem with that stuff never actually landing and being implemented quickly enough or effectively enough is that when our world leaders go back to their countries and their political systems, they're rotten at the core. They completely discount the interests of future generations. They're still taking decisions on the basis of how that's going to play out in the next 3, 4, 5-year term before the next election. Until we have the sorts of reforms that we've had in Wales, and we're by no means perfect and we've got a long way to go, but until we have those sorts of reforms with some independent statutory commissioner, could be anyone or anything really, as long as they've got some statutory powers, holding to account and calling out and being the voice of future generations. And, like I said, I often talk about calling out the madness with a bit of weight behind them. Actually, what we do is probably only ever initiatives. And so we need this new framework for governance in every part of the world. And, quite frankly, it's lonely being the only Future Generations Commissioner, so I could do with a few mates as well.
Sophie, that's a great answer. And it's been a total joy to meet you. I should say, diolch, is that right? How do I pronounce thank you in Welsh?
Diolch, yeah.
Phew. Well, diolch. Honestly, it's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for joining us on Planet Possible. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so Alex, what are your initial reflections on the interview with Sophie?
Well, one, it's the amazing foresight that the Wales and the Welsh Government had to think about this mechanism that we're the custodians of the planet, of the nation, I suppose, in the case of Wales, for our future generations. And we need to have insight into that. And the fact they did public consultation, the priorities, the way they measure that well-being was done after that sort of public consultation, public involvement, which is now something that's becoming more and more common, particularly in local authorities and devolved authorities, I suppose, is where Wales got it from. And it was really interesting where Sophie talked about the interplay between her role and the role of elected politicians and measuring that. And we have a lot of that. I'm sure we'll come on to that. We have lots of bodies where their role is to hold the government to account, as well as us in the opposition, whether it's the Environment Agency or Natural England or the OEP. They hold not just the government, but also the private sector, local authorities, the NGOs, which again is what Sophie's role is, but actually it's sort of personified. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And there are definitely models there to learn and things to roll out. I thought it was funny she talked about Gibraltar, because the UK's biodiversity, 97% of the UK's biodiversity on land and sea doesn't rest within the United Kingdom. It rests in the British Overseas Territory, which Gibraltar's one. Actually, Gibraltar's probably not one of the major players here. So actually the fact that the British Overseas Territories, and they have their own governments and parliaments like they do in Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Channel Islands, Isle of Man, those places where really, in terms of nature particularly, that's where our nature is stored, more than the very nature-depleted island of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
If we think and turn our attention to England specifically, we know there's a private member's bill, which is the Wellbeing of Future Generations bill that Sophie referred to, that Lord John Bird put forward. But it's yet to find a co-sponsor, I think, in the House of Commons. I'm interested in your thoughts on this type of approach, really, and why you think it's not got traction yet.
I know I've known John a long time, John Bird. He founded The Big Issue. I used to work with him before I was an MP. And it needs to traverse the Lords and then come to the Commons. The all-party parliamentary group on the bill, which I'm a member of and I've been to meetings of, has got a lot of MPs. A lot of my colleagues on the Labour side, there are Conservative colleagues. The father of the House, Peter Bottomley, who's the longest-serving MP, who was elected before I was born, is on that group. So I think once it's traversed, then it will get a sponsor. But actually, one of the limitations, is a very technical point, is if something's coming months away, you don't know what you're going to be doing, how busy you are, so you wouldn't commit to it. But I think once it comes to the Commons, then it will find a sponsor, because it is a very well attended group and there are a lot of MPs on it.
That's brilliant to hear. It's really positive. I was really struck a bit like you by the power of the role that Sophie's had in trying to advocate for change, really. So it's brilliant to hear that it's something we might be also doing here in England. You mentioned the OEP, the Office for Environmental Protection, and they've recently issued a report, and I'll pop a link actually in the show notes, saying that the government progress on delivery of the 25-year environment plans fallen short. In fact, they said specifically, the current pace and scale of action will not deliver the changes necessary to significantly improve the environment in England, but there is a clear opportunity to change course. So thinking about the legacy and the 25-year Environment Act setting out really to leave nature in a better state than we found it, how would you and how would Labour shift the dial so we see that pace of action changing?
So people are clear, these are the responsibilities lie in DEFRA. So we're talking about nature, woodland, other green land, air quality, water quality, waste. Those are sort of areas that plan is going. We just also have had the targets set from the Environment Act. Actually, on Monday, the statutory instrument, which will enshrine them in law, those targets, but between they were late to bring forward those targets, meant to be 31st October, they didn't do them until December, after we went to COP15 in Montreal, which is the nature COP, which I attended as well. they also diluted them slightly. Not all of them, but most of them were diluted. So they pushed the dates back or diluted them slightly. So all the time we're seeing little salami slicing of the environment targets all the time. Also, even at COP15, the benchmark's important. So if you've already depleted all the nature, which we have in this country, we had the land clearances, the Industrial Revolution, huge amounts of private ownership, taking on land and depleting it for various different things, then, your baseline's very low. So even on their own terms, the government are failing, but the terms themselves are very poor. Now, we commit to quite a lot of things at COP15, and those are international commitments like the ones that we signed to in the Paris Climate COP. And if we can't meet those, then we cannot go round the world and lecture other countries that they need to meet their targets, either on climate, from the Climate COP, the UNFCCC COP, or from the Nature COP, the CBD COP. So the government really needs to step up to the plate. One of the things that needs to happen is we need a land use framework. The law's just brought forward quite an interesting document about land use, because we've got this real tension. So we need land for people to live on. We need land for transport. We need land for agriculture and farming. We need land for nature. We've got a big argument moment around onshore renewables. So we need land for that. Solar farms, onshore wind, which is now coming back, thankfully. However, some of these things aren't mutually exclusive. So you can wood an area and you can still farm it, but not the way we farm now. You can bring boar back or deer. You can grow mushrooms and other, utilising permaculture, other food, but it's not intensive farming. It's high-end sort of farming. It's quite niche farming. But also, with the solar, the sheep won't disturb the solar. You can still farm sheep around solar. You can still do a lot of things around solar or onshore wind. So we need to be a little bit more flexible and agile. The government are not flexible and agile on this, and they don't know what to do with the land. Also, and this is not my sort of role as Shadow Environment Minister, but our planning system is decrepit and old-fashioned, and it needs to be brought up to date for the needs of the environment in this country as well as the needs of people. So there's a whole range of challenges the government needs to step up to. So it's actually structural. It's not just, they haven't quite met their target. So it's like, we'll just do a bit more. We'll plant another, couple of 100,000 trees and we'll catch up. That is part of the problem, and not a couple of 100,000 millions of trees, and planting the right trees in the right place, you see. And so you need a land use framework for that and a right planning framework. So this is the real challenge. This is the real challenge that we're having. And I don't think DEFRA have grasped any of that.
It's interesting. Really big structural change is what I'm hearing in terms of the things that need to happen in order to enable some of that progress. So let's come on to maybe a slightly thornier topic when we think about the legacy that we're leaving. So we've seen a lot of the political narrative, certainly, around storm overflows and sewage pollution in rivers and beaches that squarely place responsibility with water companies. And as a result, we're seeing what you might term a knee-jerk reaction. We need to spend 56 billion to resolve these issues quickly. And I guess one of the unintended consequences of that is the likely emissions increases that comes with it. So what's your view on how we balance the pace of resolving these issues with affordability for customers and, crucially, for the environment?
So, one, I take issue with the 56 billion figure. It's like saying to, you go to a builder and you get one quote and they say how much it's going to cost you. I'm not going to get another quote. It's fine. Just you tell me how much it's going to cost. Will they give you the lowest quote? No, they won't. This is what's happening. Two, even if we accept the 56 billion, the 56 billion is to get us to 0%. Right? To get us to nothing, to get us to no sewage in a river ever. But we're way off that. What can we get to do to 95%? To get to 95%, it's a lot less than 56 billion. So Otley's a good example. Otley Sewage Works on the River Wharf, not far from where you live, Nikki. Does it have any storage for sewage? No, it doesn't. So if it overflows, it doesn't overflow into storage for several hours. So if there's a rain event, it will go into storage and then they can process it later. It goes straight into the wharf. So will it cost £56 billion for every water company to put storage in every? No, it won't. How much will that reduce sewage overflow by? I'm not exactly sure, but it's probably over 30%. There are lots of things that can happen that means we significantly reduce sewage overflow. I think if you went to people and said, look, it's going to cost 56 billion. I mean, to be honest, it'll take a while to spend 56 billion. You can't do it in a few months, even probably in a couple of years, because we haven't got the resources, the skills, the all of that infrastructure to do that. But if we can do these few things and reduce it by 70, 80, 90% in that period, would you like that? Yes. Progress is very slow. It's very slow. And it's a bit like that Spider-Man meme where the two Spider-Men are pointing at each other. Yeah. So, who's the real Spider-Man here? So the water companies pointing the finger at the Environment Agency, the Environment Agency pointing the finger at water companies, pointing the finger at DEFRA. There's also a bit of pointing the fingers at the farmers and saying, well, actually, it's not sewage, it's agricultural runoff. And there is agricultural runoff, but there's lots of places where there isn't. And, it's definitely sewage and people can recognise sewage. It's easier to recognise sewage than it's agricultural runoff because I think everybody knows what sewage looks like because it's come from their toilet. There's a lot of, I'm afraid to say, disingenuous discourse from people. And so really, it's about not accepting it. The level of fines we've seen are dismal. Even the huge Southern Water fine is dismal. I'm going to unleash a little bit here. The water companies have piled up billions in debt. 72 billion, I think the figure is. I might be wrong. They could correct me. In debt. Haven't built a single reservoir, haven't fixed this problem. But somehow they've managed to pay out at about 72 billion in dividends, which I understand is a figure. Again, they can say whether that's right or not. But those are the figures I've seen. So what that says to me is they've taken on debt and effectively paid out in dividends. So there's real structural issues here in water industry. Now some water companies saying we're not going to pay out dividends anymore. But they're still paying huge salaries to top execs. They're still paying out big bonuses. They're still finding ways of making the shares retain their value. So there's something going wrong here. And so we need to turn the dial on this. And I think what we're going to do, one, we're going to hold water company executives accountable, criminally accountable, like we have with corporate manslaughter, not in a serious way, but they could be criminally charged. Two, we're going to not cap the fines anymore. The government, in response to us, have lifted the cap on fines. We're going to have uncapped fines, and we're going to direct the Environment Agency a lot more to ensure that they monitor and that they enforce the water quality standards.
Well, that was definitely unleashing. I'm glad you did, though. It was really clear. What do you think the future of the sector should be based on what you've just painted? Because it's a pretty bleak picture if your version of the situation is as it is. What do you think the future of the sector should look like, Alex?
I mean, I believe in regional water companies, and I believe that we should have water companies that run for the benefit of the customers. I mean, there's other issues with water companies, but I think that at the end of the day, they can be run in the right way. But I do worry about the expectation of the people that own them on the water companies to deliver these huge profits and this huge shareholder value. And so I think the owners are going to have to be more realistic that actually the point of the water company isn't to make their money. The point of the water company is to provide clean water to people, and reduce leaks and all the rest of it, and ensure that sewage doesn't go in rivers, and that there's a social tariff for people who can't afford to pay their water bills, which is obviously a growing concern now with the cost of living crisis. So we need water companies to rethink, and it needs to be driven from the people that own it, people that own the shares, and the executive, chief exec down.
Well, somebody who's spent their life in the water sector, I feel like we could do an entire podcast just on this. But I have a million more questions. But I'm going to move things forward a little bit to ask you really about devolution. We're starting to see some policy divergence. And it's interesting that we've heard from Sophie, the Welsh government are doing something different around future generations. In the world of water and environment, we're seeing some policy divergence between the devolved administrations. If you were the minister, where do you stand on that? How do you think we handle that moving forward?
You either have devolution, you don't. But you have, we're going to have devolution, but then we're going to tell you exactly what to do. Then it's not devolution anymore. But what I do believe is in floors, not ceilings. So we should have national floors, which is exactly what we've done with the Environment Act. And if Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and actually we should have greater devolution. We have a mayor in West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin. We've got a mayor in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, London, Sadiq Khan, etc. And we'll have more of them. They've just signed another mayoral deal for the Tyne, around the Tyne in northeast of England. Again, we need to devolve more powers to those people. And if those people say, that's the floor, but we're going to have a higher floor, then the central government should have no problem with that. Why should you worry about people having higher standards? If they say, actually, the floor's too high, I want to lower it, that's when the central government maybe should step in. But I honestly cannot imagine that anybody with devolved power go, we want to lower the floor, because they're nearer to people. See, everything's devolved is nearer to people than Whitehall's is to people. Smaller scale, if they do move, they'll move up, and also it's enshrined in legislation. You can't, reduce the floor. So I think that devolution is a really important principle. And if people want to have higher floors, then that's great. then it'll challenge others to raise their flaws as well, and challenge the government to raise its flaw.
That's a great summary point, Alex. Thank you. Like it, nice and clear. As ever, time has flown by and we're at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. A huge thank you for joining us. I really hope that you found the conversation insightful. I hope it's given you something to think about in your world. You can subscribe to the pod on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode, and we would love to hear your ratings and reviews too. So I'm really looking forward to sharing the rest of the season with you. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our guest today, Sophie Howe, and my excellent and passionate co-host, Alex Sobel MP. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Planet Possible is produced by Bulb. BWLB Bulb. The best ideas, the strongest content.